Welcome back to our podcast on the philosophy of Antonio Gramsci and to our fourth episode where we dive deep into one of the Antonio Gramsci's most influential ideas, hegemony. Gramsci's concept of hegemony explains how power isn't just enforced through laws or coercion, but it is maintained through culture, ideology, and the ways we come to see the world as normal or common sense. The ruling class doesn't just rule with force. It wins consent by shaping our beliefs, values, and even our aspirations. But if hegemony is constructed, it can also be challenged. In this episode, we will break down what hegemony means, how it operates, and why it remains a crucial framework for understanding politics, media, and society today. Let's get started. Hegemony. Opposition to economism. Economism. The Second International endorsed the theory that the downfall of capitalism is an unavoidable consequence of economic contradictions inherent in the capitalist mode of production. This perspective saw the proletarian revolution as an unavoidable result of these tensions and contended that socialist consciousness would naturally arise from the growth of the proletarian and economic conflicts. This perspective of Marxism views ideology as having no independent influence and considers one socio-economic class as inseparably connected to their identity. Furthermore, traditional Marxist viewpoints fail to acknowledge that the success of the Russian Revolution was a result of political engagement within a particular historical era that the Second International deemed incapable of achieving a socialist outcome. During the Russian Revolution, the previous mechanical explanation of historical transitions, which was based on the relationship between the forces of production and the social relations of productions, became less believable. The decline of socialist movements in Western Europe and the ensuing support for fascism and Nazism by the working class groups posed challenges to the traditional Marxist viewpoint. This highlighted the inadequacy of conventional Marxism in comprehending contemporary political circumstances. Connection to previous philosophers. Amid the controversial debates at the beginning of the 20th century, Russian revolutionaries such as Plekhanov, Axelrod, and Lenin used the words hegemony to support the idea of the working classes' dominance over peasants and the party's control over the working class. They believed that a culturally undeveloped environment necessitated the existence of leadership composed of the elite. In 1880s, Georgy Plekhanov introduced the concept of hegemony among Russian social democratic circles as a response to the economist beliefs that future social and political events are governed by economic laws and are beyond human influence. He emphasized the condition in Russia where a small and weak working class faced an authoritarian aristocracy and a weak middle class. According to Plekhanov's interpretation of Engels's The Peasants' War, the prevailing circumstances compelled social democratic leaders to broaden their political fight, albeit facing little progress in attaining their economic objectives. Lenin expanded upon Plekhanov's ideas by emphasizing the need to form alliances, namely with the working class, to lead the rural population and direct the path of the revolution. He used the term hegemony to describe the strategy by which the working class might gain and maintain political power by forming a partnership with the rural farming class. Gramsci stated that, quote, the greatest modern theoretician of the philosophy of praxis, Lenin, on the terrain of political struggle and organization, and with a political terminology, gave new weight, in opposition to the various economist tendencies, to the front of cultural struggle and constructed a doctrine of hegemony as a complement of the theory of the state as a force. Gramsci saw his concept of hegemony as an extension of Leninism, arguing that Lenin's revolutionary ideology, which valued intellect and personality, influenced Gramsci's ethical and political history. Despite the presence of divergent viewpoints, Gramsci praised Gramsci's perspectives and integrated them into the established body of Marxist ideology. He highlighted the influence of ethical and political history on culture, ideas, and the responsibilities of important people in both civil society and the state. Furthermore, he emphasized the importance of the moment of hegemony and consent as a crucial historical element. Gramsci expands on the concept of hegemony as a kind of leadership, building on its application by Russian social democrats like Plekhanov and Lenin to describe the proletariat's effort to form alliances with the peasants. Development of hegemony in opposition to economism. Antonio Gramsci saw the economistic readings of Marxist ideas as actual political challenges firmly rooted in political applications. The aforementioned issues were the fundamental factors that led to the significant losses experienced by the German and Italian working class movements in the decade after World War I. Gramsci's divergence from Lenin became evident at this juncture. Although both philosophers opposed the mechanistic ideas and reformist tendencies of the Second International, Lenin attempted to clarify the apathy of the masses by introducing the notion of labor aristocracies, a segment of workers in the most advanced nations who were appeased by the ruling classes. Additionally, he rejected the notion that workers could attain revolutionary consciousness autonomously. Conversely, Gramsci aimed to elucidate perplexing historical occurrences by using the idea of hegemony, which relies on cultural data rather than economic data for explanation. Gramsci's analysis of the nature and function of politics and ideology in the historical process was shaped by his refusal to accept the conventional mechanical concept of the cause and effect relationship between structure and superstructure. His objective was to restore the connection between theory and practice that had been lost in the narrow economic readings of Marx's ideas of the Second International. He aimed to develop an understanding of historical materialism that would position it as a means of actively intervening in the course of history. Gramsci's theory centers on a redefined understanding of historical materialism as a scientific study of history and politics, which diverges from the positivist views of science. At the core of Gramsci's thought lies the essential concept of contradictions in Marxism. This concept enables the accurate examination of conflicting forces and the power dynamics that exist between them throughout a certain historical period. Nevertheless, the resolution of these conflicts does not result in an inevitable conclusion. Gramsci disagreed with the idea that historical development is purely mechanical and instead viewed history as a dialectical relationship. This allowed him to connect conflicting factors to changes in history and how they influence potential solutions for resolving crises and contradictions. Antonio Gramsci's theory of hegemony aims to comprehend the intricate interplay of politics, ideology, and historical processes. He rejects the mechanical explanation of historical evolution and believed that politics and ideology play a significant part in the historical process. Conclusion. The notion of hegemony may be seen as a new revolutionary tactic that emerged as a response to the shortcomings of the economic determinism-based strategy of the Second International. The notion of hegemony may be seen as a new revolutionary tactic that emerged as a response to the shortcomings of the economic determinism-based strategy of the Second International. The economists of the Second International lacked an understanding of the fact that widespread ideological beliefs often trail behind widespread economic development. They failed to recognize that there are certain moments when the natural momentum generated by economic factors is hindered, restricted, or temporarily disrupted by traditional ideological elements. Bates asserts that a particularly deceitful tactic used by the ruling classes, which the whole Second International fell victim to, was the notion that parliamentary democracy might potentially facilitate a peaceful transition to socialism. Gramsci, like Lenin, seen the deceptive nature of the ideological facade and characterized parliament and election as simple rituals. They are effectively dominated by the ruling classes via their manipulation of cultural institutions and communication within civil society. Quote, the normal exercise of hegemony on the now classical terrain of the parliamentary regime is characterized by the combination of force and consent which balance each other reciprocally without force predominating excessively over consent. End of quote. From this observation, we may deduce that parliamentary democracy functions as a front for obtaining public approval and generates a perception of popular authority. An explanation of the concept of hegemony. Introduction. Hegemony is a concept that originates from the Greek word hegemon, which refers to a kind of leadership characterized by a mix of authority, leadership, and domination. In ancient Greece, hegemony was separated from dominance due to the fact that the hegemon had restricted power while the remaining populace experienced a certain degree of liberty. Gramsci did not explicitly define cultural hegemony, thus its exact interpretation had to be derived from his texts. Hegemony, as largely agreed upon by Gramscian scholars, is defined as the quote-unquote spontaneous consent granted by the masses to the overall trajectory of social life as presented by the dominant social group. This quote-unquote consent is granted due to the dominant position of the governing elites and, more significantly, their control over economic and cultural production. However, this idea is not mechanical. The fundamental concept of the theory of hegemony may be simply stated as follows. Human beings aren't governed not only by coercion, but also through the influence of ideas. Marx previously noted that the dominant concepts of every era have consistently been the concepts of the dominant social group. Gramsci elaborated on Marx's concept, which Marx himself only saw as a secondary result of economic interactions. Essentially, Gramsci would agree with the Marxist notion that every state functions as a dictatorship, using coercion to safeguard itself against both external and internal challenges. Gramsci, however, elaborated on this concept and said that dictatorship does not exclusively include all forms of governance. The second kind of control, as he termed it, is known as hegemony. In this societal condition, the governing process is not primarily reliant on force, but rather on the consent of the people. The ruling elite attains this consent by disseminating and establishing their ideas among the populace. During a period of hegemony, society's thought and practice exist in a state of balance. The perspective of the governing elites permeates the whole society, extending beyond the thoughts of the general population to include all cultural institutions. This is seen in all cultural facets of society, including morality, religion, customs, politics, and so on. Although not always explicit, there is still an implicit aspect of control and direction. The hegemonic equilibrium refers to a societal situation that aligns with the Marxist concept of class dictatorship. The Gramscian theory of hegemony has two overarching principles. The first aspect is broadening the scope of politics beyond the government and its operation to include the way individuals see the world at large. This concept delves into the epistemic components of daily existence, with a primary emphasis on revealing how ostensibly private and intimate facets of everyday life are in fact politically important components of power dynamics. Gramsci endeavors to dismantle the division between public and private spheres, revealing how capitalism's control renders every individual facet of existence imbued with political significance. In his works, Gramsci also emphasizes the examination of language and its pivotal role in constructing significance and understanding of the world. Gramsci's study encompasses the examination of many groups and organizations within society, ranging from activities of political society to conflicts within civil society. Gramsci examines social ideology at the institutional level using the concept of hegemony. Hegemony is attained by establishing an intrinsic connection between civil society and political society. Political society, being the representative of the dominant class, has the ability to use the dominant structures of society to mobilize and guide social groupings by obtaining their consent with their leadership. Therefore, the dominant class has the ability to spread its worldview across society and successfully conceal the actual nature of their class supremacy. The subaltern social classes acquiesce to this dominant perspective, seeing it as an inherent or intuitive understanding of the universe, and provide their consent to the ruling class. This substantially hinders the emergence of any alternative social integration. Hegemony. Gramsci's notion of hegemony is a strategic political approach that aims to comprehend the structures, dynamics, and interaction of power in contemporary liberal countries. It is not only a matter of consent, but rather a socio-political equilibrium in which the theory and practice of society come together or are balanced. This hegemony refers to the dominance of a particular social class which is spread throughout society in its various institutions and private expressions. It influences and shapes all aspects of society, including taste, morality, customs, religion, political principles, and social relationships, especially in terms of their intellectual and moral significance. Joseph Femia offers an insightful classification of the three fundamental ways in which Gramsci used the term of hegemony: integral, decadent, and minimal. Internal hegemony, as proposed by Gramsci, refers to a form or ideal type where the ruling power has widespread support and unequivocal commitment from the majority or all of the society. Femia defines decadent hegemony as an outdated style of leadership that has lost its essential qualities and deteriorated. This refers to a situation when a dominant social group, such as the feudal aristocracy or bourgeoisie, becomes incapable of efficiently promoting the interests of the whole community and loses the widespread and enthusiastic support of the significant segments of society. Gramsci's concept of minimal hegemony refers to a specific sort of hegemony that he strongly criticizes. It is characterized by its limited scope, often affecting only some segments of society, particularly the elite, who govern with the primary goal of promoting their own corporate interests. This form of control is often achieved through transformismo, which involves integrating other components of society into the dominant ruling class. Gramsci's conception of hegemony functions on two distinct but interconnected levels. The first level pertains to the formation and restructuring of alliances and coalitions, which involves the articulation and, importantly, the aggregation of interests. This process includes transitioning from specific to broad or universal concerns, the formation of certain worldview, and its subsequent spread and distribution throughout society. According to Gramsci, everything that represents the collective will of the people and the country is referred to as the national popular will. A successful hegemony is achieved when the ruling class is able to establish a collective national popular will by incorporating all the ideological aspects of the nation's population. This behavior is not influenced by any specific class interests, but rather it's shaped by the language in which the interests are conveyed. According to Gramsci, the dominant practices in a culture include the whole cultural process, including both social structures and the consciousness of people and groups. Intellectuals must recognize the parts of the mosaic rather than provide a fixed and static explanation for the ways power is exerted. The ruling class encompasses not just those who generate money and wield power, but also perpetuates its existence via the institutions, attitudes, and actions of people and social groupings. The reproduction of social interactions in Italian fascist institutions is facilitated by obtaining consent via seduction, cooptation, and coercion, as shown in his studies. In one of Antonio Gramsci's early writings before his imprisonment, namely in his January 1926 party speech, he used the concept of hegemony to refer to a kind of governance that relies on both greater material and military force, as well as the ability to gain the intellectual agreement of those being governed. He discussed the potential for the proletariat to assume control and dominance, rallying the bulk of the working class against capitalism and the bourgeois state. This understanding of the relationship between two entities is based on sociologically intricate ideas that are mostly missing in other publications by Gramsci during this period. The term the majority of the working population is of great importance since it includes almost all individuals who are employed, not just those in industrial or agricultural sectors. In addition, according to Gramsci, the class coalition would need to obtain the approval of the extensive peasant population. The word consent takes on a more significant meaning within the framework of Gramscian social theory. This chapter introduces the development of a certain line of thinking that would become the central theme of Gramsci's writings on cultural politics in prison. The holistic hegemony that Gramsci aimed to establish emphasized a harmonious and interwoven connection between leaders devoid of contradiction or antagonisms. This relationship was envisioned as organic and ongoing, fostering mutual education and reciprocity. The differentiation between the bourgeois, semi-feudal or fascist hegemonies that he critiques and the hegemonies that he supports may sometimes be ambiguous. Gramsci's use of the word hegemony is somewhat unclear. It is uncertain if he employs it as a critical concept denoting a diluted form of dominance, or whether he employs it in a more positive sense to outline the strategies that the working class or communists should adopt in order to attain power. Hegemony and dictatorship. The major focus of Gramsci's study of power relations in every society is on the concepts of dominance and hegemony. In simple terms, domination or dominio refers to the coercive and oppressive system of the state. It encompasses, for instance, law enforcement and all official and publicly visible parts of governmental authority. Meanwhile, hegemony encompasses the use of indirect means of power, including civic institutions such as schools, the legal profession, labor unions, churches, and so on. The idea of hegemony is useless without the presence of dominion. In his theory, consent and coercion are inherently intertwined, but one of them often prevails. For example, the Tsarist rule lacked significant popular support and heavily depended on coercion as a means of governance. Meanwhile, conventional liberal democracies, namely parliamentary systems, often govern with the permission of the governed populace and only resort to coercion in the time of crisis. In dominant political systems, the ruling class must actively strive to get the agreement of subordinate groups in order to preserve the current social structure. Gramsci provides further details on regimes that mostly use dominio as a means of governance. Given the interdependence of hegemony and dominion, it is inevitable that these regimes will only attain limited levels of hegemony and consent from those they control. He describes these cultures as economical cooperative. The superstructural elements of these societies are a direct reflection of the economic base without any hegemonic consensus established, and a naked form of coercion is established, which diminishes civil society. One might imagine Tsarist Russia here, especially before the abolishment of serfdom. Gramsci's assertion implies that there is a lack of consensus on the functioning of society and a lack of collective perspective among the majority that aligns with the economic and social conditions. According to Gramsci, in such settings, politics serve as a straightforward and unrefined manifestation of economic rule. Gramsci's prison notebooks highlight the distinction between quote-unquote hegemonia and quote-unquote dominio. The alternation in structure has an instantaneous impact on dominio, which is consistently linked to coherence, governmental authority, and the moment of force. However, hegemony is consistently linked with equilibrium, persuasion, acquiescence, and consolidation. Gramsci's perspective aligns closely with the Marxist understanding of the state as a coercive mechanism that enforces class-based rules. Nevertheless, he made many alterations to its actual implementation. In his book, he asserts that hegemony is a commonly accepted type of governance, with force and coercion being used only during times of crisis. G. A. Williams argues that the strength and length of the revolutionary force's impact are strongly influenced by the strength of the early dominance that had already formed among the working class. Gramsci argues that in places where civil society, which is in the realm of hegemony, is not well established, a phase of statolatry, literally state worship, may be required. However, this should never be a permanent state. Conversely, in regions where there is a well-established civil society, this phase may not be required. In the prison notebooks, Gramsci notes that, quote, the methodological criterion on which our own study must be based is the following: that the supremacy of a social group manifests itself in two ways, as domination and as an intellectual and moral leadership. A social group dominates antagonistic groups which it tends to liquidate or to subjugate, perhaps even by armed force. It leads kindred and allied groups. Bourgeois hegemony. The capitalist ruling class has a significant edge in the competition for dominance due to their exceptional organization and their position of power over the channels of communication and distribution of information. In addition to their influence on parliament, they also possess the means to manipulate public opinion. Quote, public opinion is strictly linked to the political hegemony. It is the point of contact between civil society and political society, between consensus and force. The state, when it wants to initiate an unpopular action, preventatively creates adequate public opinion. That is, it organizes and concentrates certain elements of civil society. End of quote. Due to the effective management and sophisticated intricacies of the contemporary superstructure established by nation-states, the state is capable of withstanding even the most severe crises, such as the economic crisis of 1929. Gramsci linked the intricate cultural framework of modern nations to a network of trenches in the contemporary warfare. Even when facing opposition, the dominant class may seek refuge inside this superstructure and subsequently resurface unharmed, allowing them to persist in their struggle. Gramsci disagreed with Rosa Luxemburg's 1990 work, The Mass Strike, the Political Party and the Trade Union, since it argued that the crisis alone might trigger a revolution. This booklet draws its inspiration from the Russian Revolution. However, according to Gramsci, the events that took place in 1917 were not typical, but rather an exception. Quote, in the East, the state was everything. Civil society was primordial and gelatinous. In the West, there was a proper relation between state and civil society, and when the state trembled, a sturdy structure of civil society was at once revealed. The state was only an outer ditch, behind which there stood a powerful system of fortresses and earthworks. More or less numerous from one state to the next, it goes without saying. But this precisely necessitated an accurate reconnaissance of each individual country. End of quote. The Tsarist state, primarily governed via domination, did not possess a well-established civil society that might act as cultural fortifications to enable the state to endure the repercussions of the crisis triggered by the World War I. In this instance, the swift war of maneuver was sufficient to deliver a decisive blow to the former government without the need for the meticulously planned and prolonged war of position. Although we might contend here that there was a war of position in Russia between 1905 and 1917 too. Gramsci also dismissed Trotsky's thesis of the permanent revolution since he believed it was only relevant to the particular circumstances of Tsarist Russia and not applicable to contemporary Western democracies with strong civil societies. Gramsci viewed the upheavals of 1848 and the Paris Commune of 1871 as the last occurrence in the Western world when the first war of maneuver was adequate. Quote, "The same thing happens in the art of politics as happens in military art. War of movement increasingly becomes war of position, and it can be said that the state will win a war insofar as it prepares for it minutely and technically in peacetime. The massive structures of the modern democracies, both as state organizations and as complexes of associations in civil society, constitute for the art of politics, as it were, the trenches and the permanent fortifications of the front in the war of position. They render merely partial the element of movement which before used to be the whole of war, etc." End of quote. Gramsci saw Western democratic societies as fundamentally distinct. Within these societies, a hegemonic equilibrium is present, characterized by a blend of coercion and consent that is proportionally balanced, with coercion not overpowering the consent of the governed people. Dictatorship, hegemony, and political and civil society are interconnected, forming a cohesive and comprehensive hegemony. In these cultures, the dominant power disguises its tyranny and the agreement of the people disguises the use of force. Nevertheless, neither of these conceptions can completely substitute for the other, since both elements in these pairs are essential and lack significance without their respective opposites. In contemporary democratic systems, one of these two pairs cannot completely substitute the other. Instead, a state of equilibrium is established between them. Gramsci's key argument is that in order to effectively use force, it is necessary to first create consent. As mentioned in the preceding chapter, consent is produced by intellectuals to effectively establish hegemony. Intellectuals who support the bourgeoisie hinder the development of proletarian consciousness. They do so by either attempting to merge the ideas of the working class with those of the bourgeoisie, resulting in reformism, or by fostering division among the working classes, such as by creating a rift between workers and peasants. According to Gramsci, the most important need for a revolution to succeed was the establishment of a working class culture that fully supported the interests of the working class. An illustrative instance of the ruling class dividing workers in the present era may be seen in the difference between red and blue states in the US. Red states accuse blue states of coastal elitism, while blue states accuse red states of embodying regressive conservatism. Many Western democracies have a comparable division between urban and rural workers. Additional instances of this manufactured division among the working class might include sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and other manifestations of artificially constructed chauvinism used by the ruling class to divide and conquer. Proletarian hegemony. Gramsci refers to subaltern groups as those that are in opposition to the practices and consciousness of the dominant hegemonic groups. These groups are often characterized by a lack of coherence, a lack of structure, and fragmentation. Quote, "The history of subaltern social groups is necessarily fragmented and episodic. There undoubtedly does exist a tendency to, or at least provisional stages of, unification in the historical activity of these groups, but this tendency is continually interrupted by the activities of the ruling groups. It therefore can only be demonstrated when a historical cycle is completed and this cycle culminates in a success. Subaltern groups are always subject to the activity of ruling groups, even when they rebel and rise up. Only permanent victory breaks their subordination, and that not immediately. In reality, even when they appear triumphant, the subaltern groups are merely anxious to defend themselves, a truth which can be demonstrated by the history of the French Revolution, at least up to 1830. Every trace of independent initiative on the part of subaltern groups should therefore be of incalculable value for the integral historian. Consequently, this kind of history can only be dealt with monographically, and each monograph requires an immense quantity of material which is often hard to collect. End of quote. The goal of Gramsci's theory is to identify the underlying source of new opposition groupings that have the potential to overthrow the existing ruling system and finally establish a new dominant power structure. Gramsci recognized the presence of an emerging hegemony among the working class, but he needed to address the issue of fragmentation and disorganization among workers before fully addressing this matter. Only if these problems are resolved can this seed develop into completely counter-hegemonic group and build a new system. Gramsci argued that the ruling classes exert control over society through both physical coercion and the establishment of intellectual dominance over the subaltern classes. According to Gramsci, the communist intellectuals must shatter this ideological hold in order to construct a new society. For a successful opposition movement to be established, it is necessary to break the ideological bond between the ruling and subordinate classes. Gramsci believed that education, culture, and the dissemination of knowledge and experience might help the people gain independence from intellectuals and avoid being manipulated by the ruling class. In addition to achieving political and economic power, Gramsci argued that the proletariat must also strive to gain intellectual power. This means that just as they have organized themselves for politics and economics, they should also focus on organizing themselves for cultural pursuits. Gramsci claimed that the apathy of the masses proves that the state itself does not only rule by force but by ideological grip over the subaltern classes as well. Therefore, he proposed that workers must first be freed from ideological rule in order to free themselves. Quote, critical understanding of self takes place therefore through a struggle of political hegemonies and of opposing directions, first in the ethical field and then in that of politics proper, in order to arrive at the working out at the higher level of one's own conception of reality. Consciousness of being part of a particular hegemonic force, that is to say, politica consciousness, is the first stage towards a further progressive self-consciousness in which theory and practice will finally be one. End of quote. The hegemonic struggle requires the leadership of intellectuals on a mass scale. Quote, critical self-consciousness means, historically and politically, the creation of an elite of intellectuals. A human mass does not distinguish itself, does not become independent in its own right without, in the widest sense, organizing itself. And there is no organization without intellectuals, that is, without organizers and leaders. End of quote. Class consciousness arises from an ideological conflict between different social classes, where quote-unquote false consciousness signifies a triumph for intellectuals belonging to the ruling class. Gramsci posits that the transition of conventional intellectuals to the communist side may be seen as a triumph for proletarian intellectuals who are supported by their class as the vanguards of progressive human advancement. He ascribed more significance to this process than Marx, but he did not personally observe the astonishing influence of ideologies in the 20th century. This emphasizes the significance of class consciousness in influencing social interactions. That wraps up our deep dive into Gramsci's concept of hegemony, from the ways power is maintained through culture and ideology to the possibilities of challenging dominant narratives. Gramsci's ideas remain as relevant as ever in understanding the world around us. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave a like. It really helps. And if you have thoughts, questions, or topics you would like me to explore in future episodes, reach out in the comments. Thanks for listening to this podcast about the philosophy of Antonio Gramsci. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep challenging the narratives around you.